Rome, thumbs, vomitoria, and gladiators. Most people think a gladiator's fate was decided by a cartoon gesture, thumbs up for mercy, thumbs down for death. That's not how Romans signaled. The sources are murky, but pollis verso just means with a turned thumb, not which direction. Some evidence suggests a closed fist with hidden thumb could mean mercy, while an extended thumb mimicked a sword and meant finish him. And crucially, the editor's decision wasn't a crowd-pleasing coin flip. It weighed the fighter's performance, the sponsor's finances, and the event's reputation. Another stubborn myth: vomitorium equals a fancy Roman puke room. No, in amphitheaters and theaters, a vomitorium is an exit passage that spews out crowds quickly. It's about crowd flow, not digestion. Romans absolutely indulged in feasts, and some texts mock gluttony, but the architecture term got twisted centuries later into a gross joke that refuses to die. You can tour surviving stadiums and see the vomitoria, arched corridors designed to move tens of thousands in minutes. Gladiators weren't disposable meat. They were investments. Training a fighter took months, even years. Diet, conditioning, technique. They fought under rules with referees carrying long staffs to separate clinches and stop illegal strikes. Most bouts ended before death because dead fighters don't sell rematches. Inscriptions and medical evidence show healed injuries consistent with repeated, regulated combat. Yes, deaths happened, but often as rare climaxes or punishments, not every Saturday afternoon. Lead pipes doomed Rome. Heard that one? It's more complicated. Romans used lead plumbing, but many aqueducts fed water with high carbonate content that formed protective scale inside pipes, reducing leaching. Exposure still occurred, especially via lead acetate used as a sweetener in some wines, but the lead made everyone crazy and caused the fall. Narrative oversells a single factor. Rome collapsed through a knot of problems: political fragmentation, military overreach, economics, invasions, disease. Lead wasn't the keystone. Movies dress every Roman in a toga, like it's jeans and a t-shirt. In reality, the toga was formal wear for male citizens during public life, legal proceedings, ceremonies, politics. Daily clothing was tunics and cloaks. Women didn't wear togas, they had stola and palla. The toga itself was a heavy, carefully arranged wool garment that signaled status and occasion. If you've ever struggled into a tux, you get the vibe. It's not Aaron's attire. And Nero fiddling while Rome burned? There were no fiddles. The Great Fire was in 64 CE. Bowed string instruments like the violin family are much later. Some sources say Nero performed the sack of Ilium on a stage as the city burned, which reads like propaganda. Others indicate he organized relief, opening gardens for refugees, arranging grain, pushing building codes after the fire. Nero was a controversial ruler, and hostile writers loved a dramatic smear. But here's where it gets interesting: the arena economy. Gladiator schools were private businesses or state-run with contracts, appearance fees, and medical staff. Fighters ate a high-carb barley and beans diet that built mass and endurance. Chemical analysis of bones backs this. They weren't shredded sprinters, they were durable show athletes trained to take hits and keep going. The movie image of frenzied chaos misses the choreography, the weapon matchup logic, and the referee's authority. Everything changes when you look at crowd dynamics. The amphitheater was a social pressure valve, politics, identity, and class all on display. Sponsors earned clout by delivering fair, exciting games. Killing a popular fighter despite a strong performance could backfire publicly. That's why gestures mattered less than precedent and public mood. Mercy could earn goodwill and future ticket sales. The crowd shouted yes, but the editor decided within a system that balanced spectacle and sustainability. Now bread and circuses gets quoted like all Romans were easily bribed by snacks. The phrase from Juvenal is satire, social criticism of elites buying complacency. Real Romans worked, worshipped, served, schemed, studied. Entertainment coexisted with civic life: law courts, baths, markets, collegia, military service. Reducing a 1,000-year civilization to popcorn and panem et circenses is the same flattening movies do to everything else. Let me show you another miscast detail: gladiator pairs. They weren't uniform. You had the Murmillo with a large shield and Gladius versus a Thrix with a curved Sica and smaller shield, or a Retiarius with net and trident against a Secutor with smooth helmet designed to shed that net. These pairings tested styles, not just strength. Victory looked like tactics under constraints: footwork, shield angles, stamina, not a berserk sword windmill. And those vomitoria again, think modern stadium design. Engineers borrowed Roman solutions because they worked. The Romans were obsessed with moving water, people, and goods efficiently. Aqueduct gradients over long distances, road networks with milestones, harbor logistics. They were logistics nerds. When a term gets meme-ified into a bathroom joke, you miss the real genius: civil engineering that still sets standards. Microstory: a reconstructed arena demonstration used trained performers with blunted weapons and a referee. In 3 minutes, the ref stopped the action twice for illegal strikes. The crowd booed at a premature call, and the sponsor signaled missio, mercy, after a clean knockdown. The audience left talking about technique, not gore. That's closer to reality than the body count montages. So toss the thumbs up trope, retire the puke corridor, and remember the fighters as skilled pros inside a rule-bound entertainment industry. The legions built an empire, but the arenas managed a city. Medieval times weren't a mud-soaked misery montage. Let's go there next. 4. The Middle Ages, not dark, not dumb. You probably picture the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of grime, ignorance, and random stabbing. Here's what actually happened. People bathed a lot more than films admit. Urban Europe had public bathhouses, monasteries had rules for regular washing, soap-making guilds appear in records. Moralists and saints complained that some folks lingered in baths for vanity and gossip. You don't write angry sermons about bathing unless people are doing it. Most people think medieval Europeans believed in a flat earth. Educated writers from Bede to Thomas Aquinas accepted a spherical world inherited from Greek and Roman astronomy. Universities taught Ptolemaic cosmology with a round earth at the center. Mariners knew ships dipped below the horizon. The flat earth Middle Ages were invented later as a Renaissance dunk on the past and then amplified by modern pop culture. Witch burnings, the brutal European witch hunts peaked in the early modern period, 1500s to 1600s, when printing, religious conflict, and legal shifts created a storm. Medieval courts often demanded high evidence standards. Church inquisitors frequently preferred penance over pyres for superstition cases. Executions happened, yes, but they weren't a daily medieval background event. The constant bonfires of women image is a timeline error that collapses centuries to make the past look uniformly monstrous. Chivalry gets framed like a gentleman's code that tamed warfare. The real story is messier. Knights swore oaths, quoted virtues, and commissioned poems about mercy, but they still burned crops, sacked towns, and ransomed prisoners. Rules existed and were sometimes followed, especially toward peers, but brutality against civilians remained common. The code restrained some behaviors while leaving others conveniently outside the rules. Warfare was political, economic, and legal all at once, not a tournament with roses. Now the science you never see. The Middle Ages built the university as an institution. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. They systematized disputation and commentary, argued about physics, optics, and medicine. Roger Bacon wrote about experimental method. Ibn al-Haytham's work on vision flowed into Latin Europe. Scholars debated motion and impetus theory centuries before Galileo. Mechanical clocks appeared in the 1200s. Watermills and windmills spread power across landscapes. This wasn't a knowledge blackout. It was a platform built for the next revolutions. Even the Black Death story is more than leeches and prayers. Quarantine measures emerged in Italian port cities, Trentino 30 days and Quarantino 40 days, holding periods for ships, health boards policing movement, bills of health for travelers. Communities organized pest houses, modified burial practices, and tracked outbreaks with municipal records. Treatments were based on humoral theory and often ineffective, but the administrative response, cordon sanitaires, isolation, became public health foundations. That's a legacy, not a punchline. Let me show you urban life. Medieval towns weren't just muddy alleys. They had guild rules for product quality, market courts to settle disputes fast, night watches, curfew bells, weights and measures standards, and fines for dumping waste in streets. Were they spotless? No. Did people care about order? Absolutely. City councils passed sanitation ordinances because residents demanded them. Education wasn't limited to cloisters. Cathedral schools predated universities, and vernacular literacy grew with city commerce. Notaries produced contracts by the thousands. Women in certain regions ran shops, managed workshops when husbands traveled, and in some trades held guild membership. Nuns wrote theology, copied texts, and supervised hospitals. It wasn't modern equality, but it was more dynamic than the silent peasant women montage. Technology quietly scaled. The heavy plow transformed clay soils in northern Europe. The horse collar increased draft power without choking animals. Three-field rotation boosted yields. Eyeglasses show up in the late 120s, extending the working lives of scribes and artisans. Papermaking spread from the Islamic world into Europe, lowering the cost of books well before the printing press multiplied them. Progress looked like incremental fixes adding up to major shifts. Art and architecture. Cathedrals were engineering feats, flying buttresses, rib vaults, pointed arches distributing loads to push buildings higher while filling walls with stained glass. Those windows weren't just pretty, they were complex chemical recipes for color and light. Manuscript illuminators layered gold leaf and pigments sourced across continents. Trade networks moved lapis from Afghanistan, alum from Asia Minor, and dyes from the Mediterranean. A dark age doesn't coordinate that supply chain. Medicine had a framework. Humer's theory was wrong in mechanism but structured observation. Pulse charts, urine wheels, regimen advice on diet and exercise. Surgeons like Guy de Chauliac documented procedures. Anesthesia by soporific sponges existed in some practices, and hospitals, especially in the Islamic world and later across Europe, provided organized care. Again, not modern but rational within available theory. Justice wasn't only trial by combat. You had manorial courts for local disputes, merchant courts for fast commercial decisions, canon law for ecclesiastical matters, and royal courts asserting central authority. Ordeals faded after the 120s as legal rationalism grew. Contracts, charters, and precedent mattered. The legal mind of the Middle Ages built the bones of later common and civil law. Microstory: a traveler walking from Chartres to Paris can find way stations, toll points, bridge repairs recorded in account books, and standardized coin exchanges under royal ordinance. That paper trail means administrators tracked revenue, enforced weights, and inspected bread loaves. Bureaucracy isn't cinematic, but it's civilization. So why does the dark and dumb myth stick? It flatters modernity and simplifies teaching. One bleak backdrop makes every later advance look like a miracle. But once you understand that medieval people bathed, studied, built, engineered, healed, and governed, imperfectly, creatively, persistently, the timeline stops being a cliff and starts being a slope. Swords weren't lightsabers either. Let's talk battlefield myths next. 5 warfare myths, from armor to arrows. Plate armor turned knights into statues, right? Here's what actually happens when you put real plate on a trained person. They run, vault, climb, and fight. Full harness weighed roughly 45–60 pounds, distributed across the body like a hiking pack. That's closer to a modern soldier's load than a walking coffin. Contemporary manuals show jumping onto horses, ground rolls, and grappling. In reenactment labs and museum tests, fighters do burpees, ladder climbs, and sprints. Heat and fatigue are real constraints, but immobility isn't the story. Smart weight distribution is. Now the longbow. Movies sell it as an instant arrow through any armor cheat code. Longbows were devastating weapons, especially in massed volleys at range against lightly armored troops, horses, and unshielded ranks. But against quality late medieval plate at battlefield distances, penetration wasn't guaranteed. Angle, range, arrow type, and impact point mattered. Broadheads shred flesh. Bodkins target gaps and mail, not magically bore through thick tempered steel. Agincourt and Crecy worked because of mud, stakes, position, discipline, and French tactical errors. Archery amplified those factors. It didn't single-handedly delete armor. But here's where it gets interesting. Armor and arrows co-evolved. As bows got stronger and arrowheads specialized, armors thickened breastplates, hardened steel, and refined shapes to deflect. You can see fluting and curved surfaces that shed energy. Meanwhile, archers aimed for armpits, visors, groins, any gap created by the need to move and breathe. The fight was arrow versus plate. It was systems versus systems, whether terrain, formation, morale, engineering. Silent movie suppressors are another favorite myth. Real suppressors reduce sound pressure and tame muzzle blast, but they don't turn gunshots into whispers, especially with supersonic rounds that still crack. Subsonic ammunition helps, sure, yet you're talking loud thump and mechanical noise, not a mouse sneeze. And they don't remove muzzle flash and recoil magic style. Tactical value is real: hearing protection, reduced signature, better follow-up shots, but the cinematic pew is fantasy. Samurai versus knight, the internet's least useful deathmatch. Most people think you can pull 2 warriors from different centuries, climates, and doctrines and get a clean 1v1 answer. Combat effectiveness depends on context: open field or forest, armor type and era, horse access, rules of engagement. A 14th century knight in hardened plate with lance and destrier isn't the same problem as a 16th century ashigaru with teppo in a pike line. Samurai fought in combined arms with bows, spears, swords, and later firearms. Knights did 2 lances, polearms, crossbows, pavises. The real comparison is logistics, training regimens, command structure, and doctrine under their own conditions, not a YouTube arena. Bayonets causing most WWI deaths, artillery rained. Shells, shrapnel, and high explosive did the bulk of the killing. Bayonets mattered for morale, close quarters in trenches, and as multi-purpose tools, but the battlefield was dominated by indirect fire, machine guns, wire, and creeping barrages. That's why doctrine shifted towards small unit infiltration, stormtroop tactics, and combined arms with tanks and air support. Because closing to bayonet range through uncut wire under enfilade fire was suicidal. The one-punch knockout soldier trope also won't die. Adrenaline, helmets, chin straps, and body armor soak impact. In real fights, people don't fly backward, they clinch, fall awkwardly, or keep struggling. Strikes work, but so do grapples, weapons retention, and team tactics. On a battlefield, chaos, fatigue, and gear complexity make clean cinematic finishes rare. That's why training drills emphasize angles, cover, and control, not haymaker heroics. Let me show you how armor actually shaped tactics. Heavy cavalry didn't just slam blindly. Lancers, coordinated with infantry pins, looked for soft spots and exploited disorder. Infantry carried billhooks, poleaxes, halberds, tools designed to manipulate an armored opponent. Hook and pull, trip, strike joints, then finish with a rondelle dagger at a gap. Manuals devote pages to half sorting, gripping the blade to thrust precisely into openings. You don't write that down unless it works. Everything changes when you factor terrain. Mud negates horses, rain slackens bowstrings, wind skews volleys. Stakes and ditches force cavalry to break formation. Pavises give crossbowmen mobile cover to reload safely. Gunpowder adds smoke, flash, and morale shock well before it can pierce top-tier plate consistently. The side that bent the environment ditches, wagons, palisades, often decided the fight before the first clash. Micro story, a test team put an experienced archer against a replica harness at 25 meters with mixed arrows. Some glanced, some stuck shallow at oblique angles, one drove into a visor slit only when the target was fixed and square. Then they added a moving shield and a rushing line, hit rates plummeted. That's the point, armor buys survivability so you can advance, not invulnerability so you can pose. And about cost, plate wasn't universal. Many soldiers wore jacks, brigandine, mail, or just a helmet. Commanders mixed units to cover weaknesses, pikes to stop horses, missile troops to pressure lines, armored men at arms to break through. Logistics, fodder for horses, spare strings, powder supply often mattered more than any single weapon. If you can't feed cavalry, your shock arm evaporates. Finally, the movie trope of swords slicing armor like butter needs to retire. Edges chip on hardened steel. That's why you see percussive cuts to limbs without plate, thrusts to gaps, and maces and hammers flourishing when plate quality rises. Weapon diversity is a clue. If a longsword did everything, nobody invests in poleaxes, estocks, warhammers, and crossbows. Each tool solves a specific problem. So no statues in plate, no magic arrows, no whisper guns, and no fantasy cage matches across centuries. Real warfare is systems thinking, gear, training, terrain, morale, and logistics working together. Now the explorers, no, they didn't discover occupied lands. 6. Exploration and colonization clean the record. Columbus didn't prove the Earth is round. Sailors already used the curve of the horizon, celestial navigation, and latitude sailing. The real debate in 1492 wasn't shape, it was size. Columbus lowballed Earth's circumference and got lucky that the Caribbean was in the way. Most learned Europeans followed larger estimates from Eratosthenes and others. He gambled on a smaller ocean and ran into islands before starvation settled the argument. You've heard Vikings discovered America like it's a bar joke. The evidence is hard. At Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, Norse-style buildings, ironworking slag, and artifact typology date to around 100 CE. That's centuries before Columbus. They weren't mythic drifters, they planned westward stages. Iceland, Greenland, then short-lived North American outposts shaped by resources, distance, and politics back home. Their footprint was real but brief. Thanksgiving as a pilgrim invention is a neat school play, not the full story. Early harvest feasts existed in Europe and among indigenous peoples long before 1621. What happened in Plymouth was a diplomatic moment in a landscape transformed by epidemic disease that had already devastated regional populations. Wampanoag pilgrim relations hinged on survival, alliance, and leverage, not a spontaneous kumbaya dinner repeated annually. Later New Englanders retrofitted the story to serve identity building. Maps weren't blank canvases with here be dragons smeared across oceans. Medieval and early modern charts showed detailed coastlines, ports, prevailing winds, and pilot instructions. The Portuguese roteiros and portolan charts were professional tools carved out by centuries of trade in the Mediterranean and along Africa's coast. Even unknown zones were bounded by rumor-turned data as ships pushed soundings further. Navigation was incremental, not single-hero revelation. Conquistadors weren't a handful of lucky men toppling empires by grit. Yes, the numbers were tiny compared to Mesoamerican and Andean populations, but they arrived inside complex political systems. Cortés made alliances with indigenous groups hostile to the Aztec Triple Alliance. Smallpox and other diseases ripped through communities with no prior exposure. Horses, steel, and gunpowder introduced shock more than unstoppable firepower. Local geography, civil wars, and captured interpreters like Melanson shaped outcomes as much as European arms. Manifest destiny being inevitable is a retroactive myth. Continental expansion was contingent on election cycles, fragile treaties, rival empires, native resistance, and economics. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't foreordained, it hinged on Napoleonic strategy. Texas, Oregon, and California were negotiated, fought for, or opportunistically seized when geopolitical windows opened. Indigenous diplomacy and resistance constantly bent the path, even when overwhelmed. Let me show you the maritime backbone. Caravels and naus weren't magic ships, they were designed compromises. Lateen sails for windward ability, square sails for speed, stronger hulls for Atlantic swells. Dead reckoning plus sounding lines and later better charts made risky trips manageable. The hero at the wheel is fun, but the real win was crews that could splice a line in a storm and quartermasters who rationed water without mutiny. Another quiet correction: discovery language erases pre-existing trade networks. The Caribbean and the Americas had layered routes for obsidian, shell, copper, foodstuffs, and ideas. The Columbian exchange was explosive not because a void got filled, but because two dense ecosystems, biological and cultural, smashed together. Potatoes, maize, cassava, and tomatoes transformed old-world diets. Horses, cattle, and wheat remade landscapes in the new. Diseases flowed lopsidedly, with catastrophic effect in the Americas. Movies also smoothed colonial rule into a single villain's will. Empires were messy. Crown policy, private enterprise, missionary orders, and local cabildos pulled in different directions. Encomienda, repartimiento, and later hacienda systems evolved under legal fights in Madrid and on the ground. The Black Legend and its counter-legend both oversimplify a spectrum of exploitation, reform attempts, and self-interest. If a film skips the paperwork, it misses the machine. Micro-story: a navigational dead reckoning log shows a captain correcting course after a current set him west overnight. He adjusts sail plan, notes cloud types, and records sea state. That's the daily grind that gets a ship to a coast alive, tiny decisions multiplied, not a dramatic compass slam. Cartography had its own politics. Mercator's projection helped with straight-line courses but distorted polar areas. National cartographers guarded coastal data as state secrets. You'll find deliberate falsifications, phantom islands used as intellectual property traps. Maps are arguments as much as measurements, and colonizers weaponized both. Colonial encounters weren't one-note violence or one-way influence. Hybrid languages, syncretic religions, legal petitions by indigenous leaders, maroon communities, and commercial partnerships show constant negotiation. Resistance ranged from open war to day-to-day foot-dragging and legal maneuvering. Spanish courts heard indigenous lawsuits citing royal protections, some were won. Complexity doesn't absolve harm, it reveals agency where movies show none. And about empty land, doctrines like terra nullius classified places as unused if they didn't match European agriculture, ignoring sophisticated land management, controlled burns, terracing, irrigation, agroforestry. Landscapes Europeans thought natural were often engineered by centuries of human care. Everything changes when you see exploration as risk-managed logistics and colonization as layered power, not a montage of flags on beaches. It wasn't genius men conjuring continents. It was crews, maps, microbes, allies, rivals, accidents, and paperwork colliding. Founding fathers next, less marble, more messy. Founders and revolutions, nuance beats myth. George Washington's teeth weren't wooden. Dentists of his day built partial dentures from ivory, hippo, and elephant, anchored with metal springs, and yes, human teeth purchased from the poor and enslaved. They stained, cracked, and smelled, which probably birthed the wood myth. The point isn't gross trivia, it's a window into early dentistry, social inequality, and why Washington's portraits show a tight, pained mouth. He led a revolution while fighting chronic dental misery. Most people think the Declaration of Independence landed like a perfect national high five. In 1776, the colonies were split. Loyalists stayed with Britain for reasons ranging from principle to profit. Many fled or were harassed. Enslaved people heard all men are created equal and were not freed. Women had no political rights. What changed was the argument about sovereignty, who had the right to legislate for colonists, and the invention of a public claim to universal rights that activists would throw back at the founders for generations. Let's jump to Paris. The Bastille wasn't a sprawling gulag packed with political prisoners. On July 14, 1789, there were 7 inmates, 4 forgers, 2 madmen, and a noble accused of vice. But it wasn't empty symbolism. The fortress embodied arbitrary royal power. Letters de cachet could lock you up without trial. Storming it was a strike at a system, not a jailbreak for heroes. The act mattered more than the headcount. The French Revolution wasn't just guillotine montages. It overhauled law, abolished feudal dues, opened careers to talent, secularized the state, and created a national army through mass conscription. It standardized weights and measures with the metric system, built new schools, and rationalized taxation. Violence scarred it, terror, civil war in the Vendée, but reforms outlived the bloodshed and spread across Europe through conquest and imitation. Movies love the basket, they skip the code. Back to the American Revolution. No taxation without representation was catchy, but the fight was larger: constitutional order, imperial reform, westward settlement, and who controlled trade. Britain tried to tighten administration after expensive global wars. Colonists defended their assemblies and customary liberties. When Parliament claimed sweeping authority, radicals reframed the dispute from policy to principle. That shift from negotiating subjects to self-governing citizens drove the break more than any single tax. Paul Revere didn't ride alone through cinematic darkness screaming, "The British are coming." First, writers didn't say British. Everyone in Massachusetts considered themselves British. They warned that regulars or redcoats were out. Second, it was a network: William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, local militias, church bells, and prearranged signals. Revere was detained, others carried the alarm further. The real story is a community information system, not a lone hero on a perfect horse. Now the founders in slavery, sanitized on screen, contested in life. Some, like Hamilton, opposed aspects of the system yet worked within slaveholding economies. Others, like Jefferson, wrote liberty and owned hundreds of people. Gradual abolition began in northern states during and after the war. The Constitution embedded compromises that would explode later. Treating the era as pure idealism erases the struggle abolitionists. free black communities, and enslaved resistors waged immediately. Over in France, the guillotine gets cast as sadism. It was sold as a humane reform, quick, equal application, replacing slower, class-coded executions. It symbolizes terror because it industrialized killing and made the state's power visible. But the same decade saw experiments in public education, civic festivals, and the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. Contradiction sits at the center, lofty rights next to emergency repression. Micro-story. In 1793, a Paris section petitions for bread price controls, while a priest-turned-legislator argues for religious freedom in the same assembly. That's the revolution, a crowd managing hunger and a chamber defining rights under pressure from war, debt, and every old institution collapsing at once. Let's untangle myths about crowds, too. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a drunken free-for-all. Participants disguised themselves, targeted East India Company tea, avoided looting private property, and cleaned up afterward to frame the act as political, not criminal. The mob managed optics. Likewise, French crowds carried petitions, wrote cahiers, and debated in clubs. They weren't permanent riots in wigs. Another sticky half-truth is that independence in America instantly created democracy. Voting remained restricted by property and gender. Many states kept established churches for a time. Indigenous nations weren't citizens and faced dispossession masked as treaty-making. Yet the period birthed a culture of pamphlets, associations, and lawsuits that cracked doors open. Gradual isn't cinematic, but it's how institutions shift. Here's what actually happens when you strip the marble sheen. Revolutions are paperwork and provisioning. Committees audit saltpeter for gunpowder. Quartermasters chase wagons. Printers burn through type to churn out broadsides. In France, assignats, paper money backed by confiscated church lands, swing from solution to inflationary mess. In America, continental currency depreciates and soldiers go unpaid. Finance drives strategy. Ideals don't march without shoes. Why do the myths stick? Simple narratives sell. Wooden teeth, lone riders, evil fortresses, endless guillotines. Clean images beat complex processes, but nuance doesn't kill the drama, it raises the stakes. People built new political worlds while wrestling with hypocrisy, hunger, and war. That tension is the real story. Genius time next. Einstein didn't flunk math and Newton saw more than an apple. Science legends smarter than the movie version. Einstein didn't fail math. When he was 12, he taught himself algebra and Euclid. By 16, he was solving advanced problems and acing standardized math components. The famous Einstein failed math line comes from a grading scale confusion and a broader myth that genius equals chaotic underachievement. What he actually rejected was rigid authoritarian schooling, not mathematics. The real lesson is persistence. He worked as a patent clerk while refining relativity, reading papers at lunch, and building ideas methodically. Newton's apple wasn't a cinematic thunderbolt. He told friends later that an apple's fall got him thinking about why the moon doesn't fall, same force, different circumstances. That scrap didn't become universal gravitation overnight. It took decades of calculus, data from astronomers like Halley and Flamsteed, and endless drafts. Movies love a eureka moment. Science usually looks like long patience meeting good records. Tesla versus Edison is not a superhero rivalry with two neat sides. The war of currents involved dozens of engineers, financiers, and city contracts. Tesla contributed major AC innovations, polyphase motors and transformers, while Westinghouse provided capital and manufacturing. Edison's DC had strengths in localized systems, but AC won long-distance transmission because transformers step voltage up and down efficiently. Also, Tesla wasn't a solitary prophet. He filed patents, ran labs, and collaborated widely before his later struggles. You only use 10% of your brain sounds profound and demolishes nuance in one line. Brain imaging shows widespread activity even during rest. Different networks light up for memory, movement, vision, and default mode daydreaming. Could you unlock more? Only by training skills, not by waking a dormant lobe. The myth survives because it sells shortcuts. Reality says practice, sleep, and feedback build neural efficiency. Cavemen didn't grunt their way through chaos. Stone tools required recipe-like steps, select raw material, set angle, control percussion. Some Upper Paleolithic sites show planned hunts, long-distance trade in obsidian and shells, and remarkable art with consistent conventions across regions. Language capacity likely predated such cultural complexity. When you see hand stencils in caves and beads carved from bone, you're watching symbolic thinking, not random noise. Galileo versus the Church gets framed as lone scientist against monolithic faith. The truth is complicated. Clergy included skilled astronomers. Jesuit mathematicians initially praised Galileo's telescopic findings. Conflict rose over biblical interpretation, academic politics, personality, and the claim to define natural philosophy. Galileo's dialogue mocked a powerful ally and pushed a model the church hadn't fully digested. He faced censure, yes, yet lived under house arrest, wrote, and remained a believing Catholic. The fight was over authority and method as much as heliocentrism. Here, what actually happens in real discovery. You build on networks. Einstein used Lorenz's transformations and Poincaré's insights. Newton leaned on Kepler and Galileo. Tesla stood on Faraday and Maxwell. Movies erase the scaffolding to spotlight a single face. But science is cumulative and social. Lab techs, instrument makers, statisticians, and peer reviewers form the invisible cast. Microstory: a grad student repeats a classic experiment and gets weird noise. Instead of tossing it, she checks the baseline, recalibrates sensors, and finds a setup flaw in the cited paper. She publishes a correction that changes a small constant hundreds of labs rely on. No fireworks, just better numbers and a field shift slightly. That's impact. Let's puncture another trope: the genius as chaotic slob. Precision dominates actual work. Lab notebooks timestamp procedures, parameters, and deviations. Version control tracks code. Pre-registrations nail down hypotheses. The myth of inspired mess masks the grind that prevents self-deception. When breakthroughs happen, they often look obvious in hindsight because the groundwork made them inevitable.